Next up is Anna Cook, Senior Inclusive Designer at Microsoft. Anna has over 10 years of experience in digital product design and specializes in building inclusive products. Her presentation uncovers the fundamental strategies anyone in product development can use to kickstart and optimize accessibility initiatives. Let's have a look.
Hi everyone. Welcome to our discussion today about quick tips for establishing accessibility programs. I'm so pleased to join you all and share my experience on this topic. My name is Anna E. Cook, and I am a short white woman with blonde hair and blue eyes. I use she, her, or they, them pronouns. I'm a senior designer at Microsoft focusing on accessible and inclusive design in Azure and cross-organizationally. I also recently earned my master's in creative technology and design from the University of Colorado Boulder College of Engineering and Applied Science. Today we will discuss some of the most pivotal accessibility work product organizations can do, creating robust, scalable, and sustainable accessibility programs. This discussion will be based on my own experience as a product designer in organizations. So we're going to look at this from an individual contributor's perspective rather than a management perspective. I'm not a program manager, but I have worked to establish programs in multiple organizations, and I've worked within existing programs at others. I don't think any approach is perfect, so please take what serves you and leave anything that does not. Today is about making sure you have some useful tools to choose from. Before we get into discussing accessibility programs, I want us to level set on accessibility and inclusive design, because understanding the fundamentals is important for us as we move forward. During our discussion today, I'm going to use the terms accessibility and inclusive design. These terms do mean different things, and so they're not interchangeable. If you use the definition of inclusive design from Mays, inclusive design is a method that considers all forms of human diversity to create products that are accessible and usable by all, regardless of age, language, ability, and circumstance. Inclusive design includes accessibility, but it's not limited to just accessibility. And accessibility focuses more on an outcome, which is access for disabled people using a product, service, or environment. Essentially, inclusive design is a methodology, while accessibility is an outcome. But then why do we establish accessibility programs rather than inclusive design programs? Often we establish accessibility programs alongside other types of inclusivity and equity programs. As organizations, we create these programs to ensure we account for our responsibility to creating accessible experiences. Establishing an accessibility program is about ensuring our entire organization has the resources and tools necessary to meet accessibility standards. There are many reasons that we as organizations are accountable to making accessible products and experiences. Some of those are legal ramifications, but as a designer, I consider the design perspective of accessibility to be compelling. Often when I encounter folks less familiar with accessibility, they think about accessibility more as an edge case, but that's quite untrue. Disability and the need for accessibility is more common than folks think. In the United States, 27% of the population has a reported disability, and across the globe, 15% of the population has a reported disability. Now, I can't imagine any product leader who would ever say that 15 to 27% of users should be ignored. Accessibility being an edge case is a myth that comes from the perception that there are average users or average bodies. Yes, certain flows, features, they can be edge cases. These are situations where something isn't being used as much as other things. But people can't be edge cases because no human fits an average. Not only that, but accessibility benefits everyone, even if they don't have a permanent disability. The power of inclusive and accessible design is that what we learn from disabled users extends and creates increased usability for everyone. The same voice navigation capabilities a blind user has while walking around a city benefit a driver who can't look at their phone and drive at the same time. The same captions that benefit deaf users benefit people who might be in noisy environments. That's the power of accessible design. We have the ability to make an accessible experience, but also a highly adaptable, usable, and inclusive experience with inclusive design. But even if disabilities were not so common, the need for accessibility would still be essential. Even if our organizations did not benefit, we would still need to consider accessibility. Inaccessible experiences can be damaging for disabled people's lives. An inaccessible product can lead folks with disabilities to lose access to critical needs such as employment, housing, and healthcare. Accessibility can make the difference in being involved in popular culture or being forced out of it. The need for accessibility is not just one that is beneficial to organizations, but is fundamentally a human right. So we know that accessibility is essential. And we know that our products, services, and environments need to be accessible. This is where accessibility programs come in. For us to offer comprehensive accessibility, we need to consider these needs across our organizations. We create accessibility programs to support every team and role and set them up for success. An accessibility program ensures we have consistent systems for meeting our users' and customers' needs. So establishing a program is an essential step to reaching our goals. But then what's involved in establishing and maintaining accessibility programs? I'm going to discuss accessibility programs using something I've developed called a 6E framework. This framework is just my way of organizing my thoughts around different parts that come into play when establishing and maintaining a program. I've primarily used this framework in organizations with lower accessibility maturity. An organization has low maturity when they do not have established programs or practices around accessibility and inclusive design. In this framework, we evaluate, elevate, establish, educate, empower, and engage. We'll discuss each of these 6 items at a high level. The first E I mentioned is evaluation. That means we must evaluate the current accessibility levels of our products and services. Early on, this usually takes the shape in the form of what is called an accessibility audit. Accessibility audits are a way to find and log issues in our products so that we can create benchmarks and then ultimately fix them. An audit can evaluate anything, but my personal experience largely has been auditing digital products. I recommend auditing your experiences for accessibility, even if you're just looking at an important part of a live experience to start. That way we can leverage those results to get leadership to support further accessibility efforts. When auditing a digital product for accessibility, we use the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, otherwise referred to as WCAG. These are internationally and legally recognized guidelines and have been created to meet the baseline needs of people with disabilities when they're using a digital product. In WCAG, there are 3 levels of conformance. There's A, AA, and AAA. In an accessibility audit, our teams will want to include everything marked at least as A or AA. When it comes to using WCAG, I tend to personally reference WCAG's Quick Reference Guide for any reviews. I find this to be the most easily understandable version of WCAG, and I use it like a checklist. The guide has everything currently released in WCAG criteria, along with every A level and how to meet it with examples. Whatever you're using, whatever guide you're referencing, just get familiar with WCAG and keep it handy as you're reviewing whatever product you're working on. There are many parts at play when it comes to digital accessibility. An audit is usually applied at the very beginning of an accessibility program's development, and it's used regularly as a method of evaluating current products. That said, the most important part of this step in evaluation is finding information that you can present to leadership that shows that issues are occurring and get the necessary buy-in to begin an accessibility program. No matter how your program grows, though, you will find that evaluation is a necessary part of organizational accessibility. There are a few different ways organizations might choose to handle evaluation. Some teams might choose to learn how to conduct audits themselves. Others might have enough resources to hire teams to conduct audits for them. And if you're looking to learn how to conduct an audit yourself, check out my LinkedIn Learning on Auditing Design Systems for Accessibility, which talks about how running an audit in depth can help your team. And if you're able to hire others to run your audit, I've provided some suggestions for you to use, so refer to the resources in this deck, which should be provided through DiscoConf. So as I've mentioned, the goal of auditing and evaluation for accessibility is about finding information we can present to leadership about accessibility and the significant need for accessible solutions. After completing our audit, we can share out the results with leaders and even with other team members. That way we can elevate the need for accessibility support to leadership. The reason this is such a significant step is because no product or experience can become comprehensively accessible without leadership support. I say this as someone who's worked in this space. I can tell you that volunteer-only efforts within an organization almost always come up against organizational priorities. So until we have the time and resources needed, a lot of our efforts are going to have not enough impact. That's not to say that making accessible experiences is only about perfection. Anything we do to make things more accessible is good. But ultimately, without that support, we can barely scratch the surface of the true needs that we want to account for. So take your audit and figure out a way to get in the room with leadership. This can start with working with your manager and finding ways to level this up to the highest possible level so as to gain long-term support and sponsorship. When I say share results, I don't mean sending a mass email with a spreadsheet attached. I really recommend setting time aside to present a summary of your audit results to your organization. That's how we can start to show and summarize those results. Getting in a virtual or an in-person room is a key method to sparking that conversation with leadership. In addition to sharing what you audited, be sure to emphasize other relevant aspects of accessibility as it applies to your organization specifically. I'll share a couple of broad talking points I've used in these contexts. Often with leadership, the things they want to hear about accessibility are largely related to profitability, cost reduction, and legal terms. So generally, you can discuss those aspects while also touching on human rights, depending on your audience. Along with disability communities being 15 to 27% of the population, these communities also have $6 trillion in purchasing power. Ultimately, if you can present data specifically related to your industry and your organization, use it because it will catch the most attention. It's also worth mentioning that accessibility issues, like any product bug, cost more time and money to address if not fixed early. As an accessibility issue moves through the product development lifecycle, fixing it actually takes more time and money. On average, an issue can cost 5 times more if it reaches development, 10 times more if it reaches component testing, 15 times more if it reaches acceptance testing, and 30 times more if it reaches production. And of course, many organizations are legally accountable for including accessibility compliance in their products and services. Now, this does vary according to where you live and the laws in place, and it's going to vary depending on what your industry is and the organization itself. If you work within, say, education or government sectors, you're probably already supposed to be accountable to accessibility. But there are also a lot of other industries that have some level of legal accountability, so get familiar with what exists. And if you can leverage any knowledge from a legal team that you might work with, do that as much as possible because they can maybe better speak to these aspects. All right, let's say that leadership is bought in. Maybe they bought in a little over time and they're going to support more over time. Maybe we spent a while, maybe months or years trying to make the case for accessibility, but nevertheless, let's say we've reached a point where we've gotten that buy-in, and you're wondering what happens next. Well, this is the time to establish accessibility policies, guidelines, and practices. We establish accessibility policies so that we can ensure everyone in our organization has the same goals in mind, and we create any guidance and practices necessary to support those policies. Without clear policies, the outcome of accessibility becomes impossible. We need to ensure we create policies so we know our starting points and understanding when we should be working towards those goals. Because yes, we want things to be accessible, but we also want to make sure that we can meet that outcome strategically with well-documented and executed approaches. This is going to look different for everyone, but generally speaking, accessibility policies, guidelines, and practices need to be established both for internal and external purposes. So internally, we want to establish how we support employees with disabilities, because we need to do so to ensure we can hire, retain, and create opportunities for people with disabilities with equity and respect. We need to be thoughtful about any vendors we work with and how we ensure their products for our teams are accessible. We also need to consider our external goals. That means things like what levels of WCAG are we going to meet in all new product releases, and how do we communicate with customers and clients about our compliance levels. I'll mention that creating these policies is not necessarily my personal area of expertise. So it's really quite all right to bring in somebody like an accessibility program manager, strategist, or director as needed to help with that step in particular. In line with policies, we need to ensure that everyone in our organization is educated in what they are going to do and how we plan to do it. We educate people about accessibility the same way we need to educate them on other aspects of our organizational policies. So for example, in most software companies, we have required security and privacy training. So we need that type of support for accessibility as well. Often in digital product organizations, we think that only quality assurance or engineering is responsible for accessibility, but that's not true. In fact, everyone in our organization is likely going to have some level of accountability in this space. Again, in the same way that we do with security and privacy, if a team is making work that someone else has to consume, that work should include training so people know how to make it as accessible as possible. If you're on a design team, you need to account for accessibility. And if you're on engineering, quality assurance, again, accounting for accessibility. But this goes beyond just these roles. They go into marketing, finance, legal, sales. If we're creating works for other people to consume, it needs to be accessible. All roles are accountable to accessibility in some way. But if we don't show folks exactly how that fits in their processes and practices while giving them the time, space, and resources to learn, they can't succeed. So all teams have to be educated as a starting point, but they also have to be empowered to continue development in this aspect of their roles. So not only do our teams need to be educated, but again, they need to be empowered. We cannot just hand teams a single required class and expect them to feel like they can truly practice inclusive design to meet accessible outcomes. We need to ensure all teams have access to ongoing support, resources, and community. There are so many ways you can choose to empower people, and of course, it all varies depending on your organization. But here are some of the starting points to begin supporting your teams on an ongoing basis when it comes to accessibility and disability communities. There's so many cool things to learn about accessibility, so leaving it to just one required course is not enough. Give teams the tools and the time to educate themselves and share what they learn with others. Because your best resource really is your people, your teams. So many folks in accessibility I know rose to that occasion after having opportunities to educate themselves and others. As much as possible, ensure that your teams have access to subject matter experts that they can ask questions to. Because while anybody can Google things, sometimes it really helps to have a trusted expert to weigh in and make a decision. Hire people with this expertise because they can help spread this knowledge far and wide. Ensure that teams have a community within spaces such as employee resources groups so they can communicate their own accessibility needs in safe places. Don't forget, leadership should continually speak to the significance of accessibility and the need for it within all facets of the organization. New people join organizations all the time, and the message accessibility matters should be consistent and thoughtful. And finally, engage people with disabilities for their input and design solutions together. People with disabilities are some of the best designers I've ever worked with. As we've discussed, when we solve for one need, often the least accounted for disabilities, we can see those benefits reach far past to so many others. When it comes to accessibility programs, working with disabled people is the most important part. But you might be wondering, if this is the most important part, why didn't I mention that first? Here's the thing. Even though most organizations hire and provide products, services, and the like to disabled folks, it's very rare that low accessibility maturity organizations acknowledge the importance of accessibility. So not only can it be difficult to gain disabled perspectives early on, but it can also be traumatic for people with disabilities to have to justify their own needs to an ignorant audience. This can lead to being asked well-intentioned but sometimes ableist and harmful questions. Without proper understanding of basic accessibility and usability, in terms of disability rights, we can face a lack of equitable pay for our experiences while also dealing with those problematic questions. Not only can it be difficult to gain these perspectives early on, but it can also be traumatic for people with disabilities to have to justify their own needs. Often this can lead to being asked those well-intentioned but harmful questions. It can lead to someone not even being able to share their perspectives due to accessibility issues within the organization that have yet to be fixed. Without proper understanding of basic accessibility and disability rights, we can face a lack of equitable pay for our experiences while also dealing with unreasonable circumstances. Does this mean we can't bring in disabled people until we reach a perfect place? No, but we absolutely need to be thoughtful about how we can be respectful and equitable as we learn. There are many different approaches to engaging with disabled communities respectfully. If your organization is early in accessibility maturity, you may want to consider organizations that can bring in disabled perspectives and learn from their experiences when using your product. In more mature accessibility organizations, sometimes you can leverage disability ERGs. But if you do, ensure that folks participating from those ERGs are properly compensated and recognized for the extra work that they're contributing. I know this is probably a lot of information to take in. It can be difficult to distill so much experience in just 40, 30 minutes, 20 minutes, and there's no way I could possibly capture it all. So when it comes to establishing a program, remember, accessibility programs are really about community and collective effort. No program starts with just one person alone. Although we need leadership buy-in for long-term accessibility support, it's the people in our communities within our organizations that contribute the most to these efforts. So be patient with yourself and be patient with your peers. Remember, everyone is learning, and we can gain allies by having open, candid conversations about accessibility. Even though I presented this talk as a linear progression, establishing and supporting accessibility programs is anything but linear. Everything I discussed takes time. Sometimes you might find that you backtrack or you're doing multiple steps all at once. Often establishing these programs is not linear because it's a form of change management, and that's often exceptionally multifaceted and can be complicated. But in this case, it's exceptionally rewarding as well. Just like any program, an accessibility program can take time to become established. No program can be automated. It's like a plant. It needs to be watered, nourished, put under a sunbeam, and given time to grow. It will take time to see the flowers bloom from your efforts. With that, I want to thank you all for attending this talk. I hope you were able to learn something new and helpful today. I appreciate your time, so feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn, Mastodon, Blue Sky, with my handle @AnnaECook. Thank you.